In the modern filmmaking landscape, creative control is often argued for and against in every type of project. Some think there is a limit to creative control, and there should be a cap on just how much power a director has in cultivating their vision. Others are on the opposite side of the spectrum, believing that executives and producers are useless and all creative power should go to the writers and directors. Personally, I'll always advocate for more creative control to the director, especially if they're also writing it, but I recognize that doing so opens the floodgates to every facet of production trying to get their own piece of the final cut. It's interesting to see how too much creative control can be what ruins a movie sometimes. For example, if anyone remembers The Mummy, the reason why that sucked so hard was because Tom Cruise had way too much power over it. On that note, creative liberty becomes dicier once you enter the realm of adaptations. When you adopt a pre-existing character or story, you're bound to run into conflicting perspectives. Everyone perceives media differently, and that can really affect, alter, or deteriorate a director's motivation with the adaptation. It becomes even more difficult when the character in question is so tonally inconsistent that trying to create a product that can match what a studio and director have in mind can be impossible. And no character embodies that inconsistency more proudly. Batman and creative control appear more in conversation than you may assume. Every Batman film has had a fair amount of clashes regarding where to go with the character, and it solidifies how diverse the icon is and how many ways he can be interpreted. Before the release of Tim Burton's Batman, the character was in a difficult position. Comics around this period portrayed him as dark and brooding, whereas his only on-screen appearances portrayed him as
Look there! A shark! What's that in his hand?
Adam West, I love you, dude. The original Batman film was conceived as a darker film. Multiple studios before Warner Brothers were approached and subsequently shut down the idea of a bleaker film because of the widespread precognition. Because of this, Batman '89 was under what I consider a screenwriting hell. One draft contained the idea of casting Bill Murray as Batman and Eddie Murphy as Robin, so it's clear that some ideas were to maintain a lighthearted atmosphere. Because of his experience with comedy, Warner Brothers hired Tim Burton with the agreement that he'd be able to rewrite the film, in which he took inspiration from darker-toned comics such as The Killing Joke. Along with the casting of Michael Keaton, an actor who at this point was known more for comedies, the expectation would probably be something high-spirited, but Warner Brothers allowed Burton a darker tone, which led to one of the biggest films of 1989. That year introduced a Batman many have not seen before, a mysterious, deep-voiced recluse, played by a guy who starred in a movie called Mr. Mom. I was surprised to learn that Keaton's casting was not Burton's suggestion because, they worked before, but rather an idea by Warner Brothers themselves by producer John Peters. The two parties worked in tandem. What initially started as a comedy film morphed into a brooding action saga because Warner Brothers was willing to give proper creative freedom to those involved, like Tim Burton. The results spoke for themselves, as Batman was both a critical and financial success. It was an extremely eerie film, especially with a lauded performance from Jack Nicholson, though some parts still maintain the campy quality of the Adam West era, such as some really forced Prince needle drops. These were not approved by Tim Burton. Regardless, a sequel was greenlit shortly after this success, and Warner Brothers envisioned Burton and Keaton returning to their roles. Unfortunately, Burton initially didn't want to come back. Not only did he have a distaste for sequels, but his longtime producer Denise DeNovi reported that Burton didn't feel creatively liberated with the first Batman film. In her words, Batman was only about 50% Tim Burton. Now, this was probably just said for sensationalism, but considering Burton joined after Warner Brothers had the script ready, there is probably some truth to this. This is why, in order to pull him over, Warner Brothers promised full creative control of the sequel, allowing him to dig deeper into the gothic tone that his films were known for. I feel like it can't be understated just how much control Burton had over this film. He not only removed a lot of the alumni from the previous '89 film in favor for his colleagues, but also barred some producers from the set, including the aforementioned John Peters. He also replaced a previous writer from Batman '89, Sam Hamm, who... That is some Looney Tunes ass name. Who experienced a lot of interference from Warner Brothers while writing the initial drafts for Batman 2. Originally, Two-Face was conceived as the main villain following his setup in the first film, but Warner Brothers lobbied hard for the Penguin, feeling he was more prominent. Maybe this was for the best because Hamm's scripts for 2 also included AK-47 wielding Santa Clauses as potential villains and just some Really wild ideas. Burton and Daniel Waters, the man he chose to replace Ham, worked together to retool the initial drafts of Batman 2, which included a lesser focus on its sequel status. Ham's original script tied very closely with the first film, but because Burton thought sequels were dumb, rewrites essentially turned the story into a standalone film. Changes included the Penguin being more animal-like, Catwoman being less sexualized, which they didn't really do a good job, let's be honest, and Batman speaking less, amongst others, that culminated in Batman Returns. Returns was initially criticized by Batman fans because at times it didn't really feel like Batman. It's odd, some would argue blowing someone up with TNT is a Batman staple. I notice a common theme between Burton and Batman is that he often chooses writers who don't necessarily like Batman. Tim Burton himself doesn't really like the character nor comics in general. Daniel Waters thought Batman's no-killing rule was stupid, and other script doctors who also showed a disinterest towards Batman worked on the film. In other words, Warner Brothers succeeded in creating a film that matched Burton's vision, but the trade-off was a movie that ended up either confusing or polarizing audiences. Many lauded the creative directions the film went in, such as the production design, but story-specific decisions such as the heavy focus on Catwoman and Penguin were criticized. It also didn't help that Burton's tone scared younger audiences, with many complaints being thrown at Warner Brothers for approving many of his traits. On top of that, Batman Returns was released at one of the worst times for cinema. The summer of 1992 was packed with an onslaught of films, so even if Returns ended up being one of the bigger names that summer, it still flopped in the face of its predecessor, only $200 million in the face of $400 million. After the tragedy of McDonald's pulling their Happy Meal tie-in, Warner Brothers was on lockdown. Batman was one of their biggest names, but the sales started decreasing, so the blame was ultimately placed on Burton and the amount of control he had on Returns. The solution? Set everything on fire. Burton stayed to approve Warner Brothers' next choice of director, Joel Schumacher, but after that, it was wraps. Burton had separated from the next film entirely, and though he stayed as a producer, it's hard to see where his influence remained. Michael Keaton stayed on the project and was even enthusiastic after Schumacher pitched the new film as a prequel with inspiration from Batman Year One, but Warner Brothers saw the plight of a director of new ideas and said, "That's stupid, you're dumb, scrap it, you're making a sequel," which led to Michael Keaton leaving the project and Schumacher with no alumni to go to. I feel like it can't be understated how much control Warner Brothers had over this movie, even going as far as to admit the film was created with full merchandising appeal. A lot of Schumacher's ideas, such as the return of Catwoman and Scarecrow as the main villain, were scrapped in favor of a new love interest and a brand new Two-Face. It seemed like the goal was to completely sever Batman Returns with Batman Forever. Without trying to sound disrespectful, Schumacher operated as a sort of Boy Scout for Warner Brothers. He shared the same sentiment regarding the severing, as he purposefully directed production design in a way that disconnected from Burton in every way. Burton was bleaker and noir-like, so Schumacher highlighted colors and a sort of bounciness. Despite this, Schumacher witnessed the film going through heavy edits as the release date came closer. There are numerous deleted scenes in this movie, many that echo the darker tones seen in the previous films, but they were cut in order to dodge potential backlash. Some of these scenes included Bruce talking to a gigantic bat and a different closing shot of the entire film. In general, Schumacher did envision a darker film, but that's severely undercut when Forever opens with,
"Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?"
I'll get drive-through.
Batman Forever ended up making more money than Returns, but was critically panned. Whereas the Burton films were more sophisticated, Warner Brothers had tampered much more of the film, and the final result showed several holes. Also, on a personal note, Val Kilmer is a significant downgrade from Keaton. Kilmer doesn't really have, that mystique that he had. Instead, just feels like a very lifeless puppet. However, because Forever was moderately successful at the box office, it convinced Warner Brothers that less creative freedom was the way to go. So for Batman and Robin, Schumacher once again had to play Boy Scout. During the screenplay stages, Warner Brothers wanted a story that was more toyetic, or in other words, a story that could shoehorn more toys. Warner Brothers wanted it to be so toyetic, in fact, that toy manufacturers would regularly attend pre-production meetings. Chris O'Donnell hated this era of a rare creative freedom, even lamenting that working on Anne Robin felt like he was making a toy commercial. And if we're being honest, he was kind of right. In addition, I'd like to mention that for Batman Returns, the original idea from Warner Brothers was to include a soundtrack that emphasized pop more than an orchestra. Danny Elfman, who created the soundtrack to 89, nearly left production upon hearing this. Afterward, he was reasoned with, and Returns retained the orchestral score. I'm telling you this because Warner Brothers finally got their wish with Batman and Robin, as the soundtrack was filled with alternative rock and pop songs, none of which ever fit Batman in the slightest. Warner Brothers also fast-tracked production, or in other words, they sped things up. Traditionally, there was a 3-year gap between Batman films, but with Batman and Robin, there were only 2. This led to a myriad of time constraints that affected casting, such as George Clooney replacing Val Kilmer because he was unaware of the fast track in the first place, and assets from Batman Forever being reused, such as the suit worn in the third act. Not to worry though, Schumacher's influence did appear in small chunks in Batman and Robin, like this ass shot of Batman. That was him, I'm not joking. Batman and Robin was such a failure critically and commercially that it didn't matter what they did next. George Clooney said it best once filming ended when he reportedly commented that they killed the franchise. Batman had reverted to the days of firing shark repellent, and it was mostly because of the battle over creative control. Enough creative control is what allowed Batman to strive, but it also caused his downfall, whereas limited creative control allowed him room to breathe, but also caused his downfall again. The failure of Batman and Robin did do some good, however, as the status quo needed to be changed. With Nolan's trilogy, he experienced much more flexibility of the character, and so did Matt Reeves, who was able to create a 3-hour detective film of the character, which is still insane to me, because a 3-hour film is a rarity nowadays. Batman and Robin may have also inspired studios to encourage even less creative control. MCU films are notorious for being extremely restrictive and rarely allowing directors the room to expand their ideas. Despite this, these films are still largely successful, in the same way that Nolan and Reeves' projects were also successful. With this video, I hope I illustrated how important creative control can be at its best and at its worst. Some films need less of it, and some films need more, and I thought using Batman as a scapegoat could properly display that. Now on to part 2 of this video, where I explain why we need George Clooney back as Batman.